For my paper, I took a closer look at the film American Beauty and how it shows Lacanian ideas of desire and fantasy. Jacques Lacan was a major post-structuralist thinker who studied the psychoanalytic movement during the 20th century. His ideas branched off of Sigmund Freud's idea of the psychosexual development. Lacan's idea on the psyche can be split into three structures: the real, the imaginary order, and the symbolic order. The real is the earliest stage. This occurs from 0 to 6 months. This is when all we have is our most basic human urges and needs. Lacan believes that this is the only time that we can be whole, because the moment that we give name to something, there becomes a sense of absence. If one is something, then they are also not something. The imaginary order is when an individual enters language. This is where someone starts to make up meaning and where urges become signs. The symbolic order is when one begins to create meanings from language and signs. This is the order where one must follow the rules of society and culture, sometimes referred to as the big other. Lacan branches off of these three structures and creates what he calls the mirror stage, the ideal ego, and the ego ideal. The mirror stage occurs between the real and the imaginary stage at 6 to 18 months. This is when a child begins to identify with one's own image and starts to recognize oneself as I. The ideal ego is the idealized image of oneself when they look in a mirror. They picture themselves as whole or complete. This is the idea of perfection, but this is imaginary. The ego ideal is associated with the symbolic order. Lacan's idea is that the ego ideal is the big other. This is the gaze that one feels that they need to impress. This is the ego that watches over and propels a person to do their best and pushes them to strive to their ideal self. Lacan says that desire and fantasy come from the imaginary order and the symbolic order. Lacan's idea towards fantasy come from the idea that our desires are not truly our own. Our desires are manufactured for us based on our society and culture. In the film American Beauty, the main character, Lester Burnham, has been repressed by society's rules for so long that he has lost his ideal self and has lost all desire and fantasy in his life.
I have lost something. I'm not exactly sure what it is, but I know I didn't always feel this sedated.
This is until he finds something new to fantasize about, his daughter's friend, Angela. Angela is the representation of the ideal feminine beauty. She is given the virgin whore characteristics. She is young and beautiful, yet still seen as sexually matured and experienced. The red rose petals are meant to symbolize sexuality. For Lester, this is the awakening of his sexual being. This is the spark of desire, and Angela becomes his new object of desire.
Spectacular.
Lacan believes that desire has little to do with material sexuality, but the social structure and stricture that we are living in. One of Lacan's ideas is that the fantasy of oneself can be filled by another person who emulates the qualities a person wishes they had. For Lester, he wants to be youthful and sexual, and Angela is what Lester projects his fantasy onto. He does not exactly want to be with her, just the idea that she portrays. It is also believed that the object of desire is a way for us to establish coordinates for our own desires. Lester starts becoming rebellious and changing who he is to who he wants to be. His ideal ego is to feel young again. He wants little to no responsibility in his life. He wants to enjoy life and no longer be sexually repressed.
Mine. 1970 Pontiac Firebird, the car I've always wanted, and now I have it. I rule!
Actually, I'd like to fill out an application.
There's no jobs for manager, it's just for counter.
Good. I'm looking for the least possible amount of responsibility.
Lester starts to change his life so that he can get closer to this fantasy. He quits his jobs, starts fighting against his controlling wife, and starts getting power back where he was powerless, while doing activities that remind him of his youth.
Do you party?
Excuse me?
Do you get high?
As the film continues, Lester's fantasies of Angela become more vivid. each one becoming more physical. It starts with only looking, then leads to physical touch, next sexual touch, and then reality.
I wanted you since the first moment I saw you. You were the most beautiful thing I have ever seen.
This is my first time.
You're kidding.
This is when Lester's fantasy shatters. For him, she was no longer the mythical, carnal creature of his fantasies, but a nervous child. He switches from sexually driven man into a father figure. She is no longer his sexual fantasy or desire, but is now like a daughter to him. Desire relies on there being a lack, something that would hold it back from being reality. In the case with Angela, Lester envisioned her as someone that she could not be because it was his ideal ego that he created for her. But this is what makes it a desire. It is what continually perpetuates our need for desire and fantasy. We are continually changing what we are looking for. Whether it be in ourselves or projected onto others, we are always reaching for something that is not reality.
You get Lacan's point. Fantasies have to be unrealistic because the second that you get what you seek, you can't want it anymore. In order to continue to exist, desire must have its objects perpetually absent. It's not the it that you want, it's the fantasy of it. So desire supports crazy fantasy.